So now that we've talked about a population and we've talked about numerical and categorical data, let's talk about the difference between a population and a sample, and things that describe populations and things that describes samples. So our population is the entire set of individuals or items that we're studying. It could be people, it could be a certain set of cars, it could be all Madison students, however we choose to define that. And that's our population. That's who or what we are studying. The parameter describes some characteristic of the population. So it could be the average of the population, it could be, if it's numerical data, or the standard deviation of the population, or if it's categorical data, we could talk about the proportion of the entire population, proportion of people who voted for a particular candidate, or who prefer a certain parking policy, but a parameter describes a population. And we can remember that because they both start with P. Parameter describes a population. Okay, so P goes with P. Okay, so population size, we use a capital N. We very rarely talk about that. Then a sample is a subset selected from the population. And if you see my Venn diagram here, the big green oval is our population. It's everything that we're studying. And then the sample is a subset. It's entirely contained within the population. Every item comes from the population, but it's a smaller group from the population. Okay? And a characteristic of the sample is called a statistic. It summarizes the characteristic of a sample. If we took a sample of Madison students, let's just say we took a class from the senior class, 20 people, and we found out an average, that would be a statistic. It wouldn't necessarily accurately describe the entire population, but it would just describe this group that comes from that population. Okay? And so just like the parameter, what describes a population, they both start with P. A statistic describes a characteristic of a sample, and they both start with S. Okay? And then the sample size. Sample size is N. There's a symbol that we use called S, but that doesn't stand for sample or size. That stands for standard deviation. But the symbol for the sample size is N, which is the number of items that we've sampled. Okay? And then for the characteristics, we talk about, we have these different symbols, this language of statistics. Okay? And so we have one set of symbols for numerical data and one set for categorical data. So for numerical data, our average or mean, we essentially use those synonymously. The mean for an entire parameter is mu, and the mean of a statistic, a subgroup taken from that, is called X bar. So if we were taking the mean of Madison students' heights, and we were able to take a census of all Madison students, that their average height would be described with a mu. But if we just sampled randomly from Madison students, we measured their heights and took the average, we would call that X bar. X with a line on top is called X bar. Okay? And then standard deviation and variance are related to each other. These are measures of spread. And so standard deviation for the whole population is symbolized with a sigma, lowercase sigma, which is kind of a circle with a squiggly tail on the end. And for a sample, the standard deviation is just S. And then kind of makes some kind of sense here that the variance, sigma squared and S squared, that if you have the variance, in order to find the standard deviation, you can just take the square root of the variance. All right. And there are slightly different formulas for standard deviation from the population versus from a sample, and for variance. But most of the time we work with sigma and S when we're doing problems. For category, and then our sample size, again, we said is N. We'll use those when we take samples. For categorical data, for proportion. There's less kind of going on there. And so P stands for the proportion of the population. Some people, when they start, they think that P stands for population, or they think that P stands for parameter. P is a parameter, and it does describe the population, but what P stands for is proportion of the population. And then if we took a sample and found the proportion of that sample, this would be the statistic with P with a little hat on top, which we call P hat. And then again, for our sample size, we use those both for numerical and categorical data, is N. Okay, and so we use this because what we're trying to do is summarize, organize, and simplify, and so this is the written language for these symbols, characterizing characteristics of parameters, mu, sigma, sigma squared, P, and then symbolizing statistics from a sample, x bar, s, s squared, p hat, and n. That's it for now.